Welcome after the break. I hope you enjoyed the meal. Just a small reminder, at 7 p.m. we are starting the after party. So if you are leaving, please come back and be with us at 7 p.m. And this is the time to start next lecture in track number 1. Here on the stage we've got Patryk. Patryk is with me and he will talk about the magic of Spring. How does it really work? The stage is yours.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Patryk Piechaczek and today we will talk about the magic of Spring. How does it really work? So a little bit about me first. My name is Patryk. I'm a software engineer at Global Logic and I'm a fan of Kotlin, clean code, and a lover of debugging and caring in the code. And this is the reason for the presentation, because it seems to me there is no better way to understand something, like in this case framework, than just building it. So who uses Spring? Raise your hand. Who knows okay, a lot of you. So who knows the rule that we need to remember when we are using the Spring? Like, for example, here the transactional method will not work, yeah, because we are calling in the scope of the same bin. Or it sometimes will not work if we have a final method. So who knows the rule? Okay, and who knows why it's happening? Okay, so we will try to answer to some questions. We will try to implement something like Spring, and we have only 45 minutes. So if something is not clear, I would recommend you to scan the QR code, because there is a repository with my code. So you can always take a look on the GitHub, and I will simplify it a little, yeah? So a few seconds for you. Okay. I will show you in the end, so no worries. So yeah, so let's start to coding. Here I have just a simple application. I can run it. I have one model. It's a company. I hope that you can see it. And there is just one DAO. And you can see I have only a logger, so I don't want to add any dependencies to entity manager or whatever. So please imagine that I'm storing something to database. And I have something like company service imp with one dependency, company DAO. As you can see, just almost pure Java application without any framework. And yeah, I just run the application and you can see the service is starting. We have DAO and we try to save something, yeah, because we have create company method. But let's imagine that I'm going to add a transaction. So what should we do? At the beginning, begin transaction. We don't have any framework now. At the end, we need to commit the transaction. And if something is wrong, we should try it and handle the exception. How we can handle the exception? Let's catch it, and exception like this. And in case of any problems, we should roll back the transaction. Okay, I have typo, whatever, begin transaction. So let's put a logger here. Begin transaction. The next one, commit transaction. As I mentioned, I don't want to create entity manager, but we should do something like commit. But let's keep it simple. Where is here? But here we are committing. And in the end, we need to implement rollback transaction. Okay, we should probably also throw the exception to another layer like this. So let me run the code one more time. And here we have something similar to transaction, but instead of logging, we should just use entity manager. Yeah, and we have a begin transaction, and in the end, we are committing it. Okay, but I have a second method to update. Where is it? Update company. So how we can use exactly the same approach? So I'm going to use a design pattern like copy and paste. So let me just do something like this. Because it's really hard to extract the command part, because at the beginning it's just one line, and at the end we have some catching. Of course, we can use the functional programming, functional interface to execute the code in the middle. But I'm going to show you another approach that we are using in Spring. We can use a proxy. I don't want to go to the details, but we can use proxy to do something before our method and do something after our method. So it's exactly, I would say that it's a great example of for the transactional. At the beginning, we are begin transaction, at the end, we are committing. And if we are talking about the proxy, we can think about Dynamic Proxy and CGLib. So Dynamic Proxy, it's great. We can create a proxy using Dynamic Proxy without adding something to our Maven project, Gray project, or whatever, because everything is in our JDK. CGLib is just external library that we need to import to our project. But the main difference is that the Dynamic Proxy works on interface basis. So probably you can see in your project something like my service imp and my service, yeah, because we need interface to do this. CGLib doesn't require interface, but on the other hand, it will not work on the final method because it's based on the class extension. So to use proxy, we need to override the method, but it will not work with the final method. Okay, so which one should we use? So let me go to the documentation, and here is Spring AOP defaults to using standard JDK Dynamic Proxy. Okay, so we know that Spring uses by default Dynamic Proxy. So let me check. Here I have the second application. It's just almost pure Spring application. And I'm not sure that you can see it, but there is something like CGLib. So something is wrong. We have an interface. So we should use the Dynamic Proxy. Everything is okay, but they change it. It's true if you're talking about the Spring, but if you're talking a Spring Boot application from version 2, by default it uses CGLib because to prevent nasty proxy issue. What is this issue? So let me back to our code, and I just change it to use Dynamic Proxy. And let's say that if in my company service imp, I will inject the implementation, not just interface. And we will have error message that we cannot do this because we are working on the Dynamic Proxy. So consider injecting the interface. Okay, so they decided to change it. And I would say this is important because probably, I don't know, maybe most of you was able to see something like company service imp. And I would say today, when we are using CGLib, it doesn't make sense to do something like this because Spring will not require interface. Okay, so how we can do this? Let me go to our code, to our application, and just copy what we have in the step 1 to step 2. And we have application. And let me rename the name of this class to step 2. And how we can create a proxy. As I mentioned, we don't need to add anything to our project. Everything is in JDK. So I'm going to create a proxy. Okay, so we have methods like, we have class like proxy, and there is something like proxy, this one, and here we have new proxy instance. And what we have here? We have 3 parameters. So let me copy. Loader, so we can take the loader from the main class. Class, get class loader. The second one is class of interfaces. So I'm going to create an interface, create a proxy for interface company service. Company service like this. And with name company service. I can remove the redundant code from this part. Okay, so how we can create a new array, new class with interface. Company service. Okay, so we have the second parameter, and the last one, invocation handler. It's an interface that will be responsible for our proxy, for our transaction. So let me create a new package, framework, and here we will create something like proxy handler that implements the required interface. So here we have only one method, invoke. So how we can call our method from the implementation? So we can take the method, and there is something like invoke. we should use the object and arguments. Almost everything is in the method, but it will not work because here is a proxy. So we will back to line number 8. So we will have infinity recursion. So that's why we need to create object to handle with our implementation. Okay, add to the constructor. And now we just implement the proxy with exactly the same logic that we would call the method directly from the implementation. Okay, so let's finish it. New proxy handler, and we should handle company service imp, and it has company DAO imp. Here we have, okay. So let me check that it works. Yeah, and you can see that we are returning object, so we need to cast it. And let me run the code. Yeah, and it works because I call it the create company, but from the proxy. But let's imagine that I just do nothing here. And this is a magic, yeah, because we will overwrite it, and we are not able to see what we are just did, yeah, there is nothing. We can, for example, overwrite it to returning 4 if we have adding method, yeah, so 2 plus 3, we can overwrite it to 4. Okay, but we did it for some reason to move the logic related to the transaction from our company service imp. So let me start copy and pasting, just not like this. I need 3 methods. In my proxy handler, I'm going to add methods that are responsible for beginning, committing, and rollbacking. I need to add the logger. And in the end, I need to handle the transaction. So almost the same, copy and paste. And in my proxy handler, I just don't want to call my method directly, but first I need to begin transaction, and the end I need to commit it, but in the middle I need to store the result and just returning it in the end. Like this. So finally I can remove the logic that are responsible for transaction from my company service. Yeah, I hope that's all. Here. Let me format the code and start the application one more time. And we can see that we begin transaction, but in proxy handler. So now our proxy handler is responsible for it. So at the beginning, we are just begin transaction, calculating the result, and committing it. And so let me do something similar, but for CGLib, just for information. I'm going to use Dynamic Proxy, but how we can do this using the CGLib. It's almost the same, but we are implement method interceptor. And here we have object. We don't need to store in the constructor. And the main difference is here, invoke super. Because Dynamic Proxy, we are working with interfaces. CGLib, we are working with extension class. So you can see that we have the invoke super. So let me run the application. We should have exactly the same result. But what is important, we are begin transaction. When we back to our company service, you can see that we don't have implementation. We don't have interface. When I put the final, it will not work because we will not be able to override the final method. Yeah? And it requires, and CGLib required something like this. Okay, so now we have, now we know how we can create a proxy. So let me go to the dependency injection framework. Because as you can see, it doesn't look very well, yeah? It's our application. So let me change the step to the next one. And here we have something like creating proxy, class loader, and I would say that our framework should be responsible for something like this. So how we can do this? I think that we can do exactly the same. We should use exactly the same approach that we have in the Spring. So let me copy and paste the code from the Spring. Here I have Spring Framework application, I have an application context. So in my code, I'm going just copy and paste, and we will see what we should change. Okay, so first I need to have something like application context, We don't have it, but it should not be a big problem. Yeah, I can create a new class application context. Let me back to the step 3. Here we have a static method, so I don't want to do this. I can have everything in my constructor. And this is my main class, so I can just copy step 3 up to this line. And I don't need to put anything from the arguments. So we have a constructor, so let me edit. It should be more generic. I don't want to create a constructor for step 3 app, but let's call it app class. But why we need this application context? Because somewhere we need to store our beans. So I would say it's a good place to do this. Set of class. And we can call it component beans. Okay, and there is the only one library that I added. It's reflections. Why? Because I need to find all classes that our framework should take care about it. So how we can do this using Spring? I will create a new package like annotation. And in Spring, we have annotation like component. Of course, we have more like service, repository, and so on. But let's keep it simple. We will have only one annotation. And what should we put? Target, maybe on the type. And we are using the dynamic proxy, so the class is created on the runtime. So let me just copy and paste it, and we have it. What is the second annotation that we can use for the beans? How we can inject something? Using the auto-wired. And I would say that here we can be even better than Spring, because when we are using Spring, we can inject something using constructor, fields, and setters. But here we can tell our framework that we should only do this using constructor. Okay, so let's do this. And yeah, component. So we have two beans, component service imp and DAO. So now we are defining our beans. And let's back to our application context. So I can create a reflection class using the package. So I can take the package from the app class, get package, get a name. Okay, so I have almost everything. And I should store my component beans using the reflections. So hey reflections, please get all classes with annotation component. And probably we should filter it because we want to have only implementation. Filter is interface, and finally we can store it. Collect to set. Okay, so let's back to our application. Here we have one public method getBean. Okay, so now I'm going to take bean component service. So we need to create the method. It should be more generic. So we should return the T. And here what we have, we should return the bean with exactly the same type, class. Okay, I should probably think about a better name, but I think that it's enough. And please note that I'm going to skip almost all validation because we don't have the time for it. But probably here we should check that it's interface because we are working on the dynamic proxy. If not, we can find the implementation. So find implementation. So for example, I'm going to create a component service, so I need to find a component service imp. And how we can do this? It's, I would say, easy because we already have the collection that stores the implementations. So we can take our component beans, create a stream, and filter it if our component has annotation, has interface. So get interfaces, but it's array. So let me just wrap it using list because I'm going to check that the collection contains something. Contains this class. So now I'm checking that my company service imp contains interface company service. And I think that's all. We have implementation and exactly the same. Yeah, if we have more than one implementation, we will not be able to find it, like in Spring. So let me imagine that I'm working with the Spring application. I create the second implementation of company DAO. So here, and let me back to the previous one that we cannot auto-wire because we have more than one implementation. Yeah, we have company DAO imp and company imp 2. So we should throw some exception, but if we have less than one, we should find first or else throw exception. Okay, so we have the, we need to cast it, and we have the implementation. So finally, we can create the bin using the implementation. And what is needed to create object? An idea. Constructor, yeah? So here implementation. So we can use create constructor for the same type and find constructor using the implementation. So let me import everything. There is constructor, okay. There is a find constructor. Let's create a method. And how we can find the implementation, how we can find the constructor. Using the implementation, we have something like get constructor, constructors, okay. So we have array. Let's change the type to our generic one. And exactly like in Spring, if we have only one constructor, then we can return it. Constructors, let's take the first element. But if we have more than one constructor, we need to put auto-wired. So how we can do this? Let's take all constructors, stream, and let's filter everything. And if our constructor has annotation, is annotated auto-wired, then we should find first, of course, we should also check that we have more than one, then we should throw some exception, but I don't want to waste your time to do this. And yeah, we just found the constructor. Okay, so what is the next step? We have constructor, so can I create a new object? Constructor, new instance, I need two parameters. So let me create an object, it's array, arguments, and find arguments using the constructor. And it's a tricky one because we already have it, where we have our arguments. Yes, so first maybe we can take about the parameters type, get parameters type. And finally, if we have a parameter types like, I'm talking about the company service imp. Here we have one constructor with company DAO. So how we can find the arguments for company DAO? We already have it, yeah? Return, parameters, stream, and we should map the parameters like company DAO to company DAO imp using our existing method, getBin. So we have recursion here. We can use the replace to method reference, and finally we can return the arguments. So let me put the arguments here. And yeah, surround with try catch. Oh, a lot of exceptions, so let's keep it simple. I'm going to catch everything now and wrap it with runtime exception. And I think that's all, so let me test it. Yes, and as you can see, we just created a proxy. Maybe I can run it using debug. Yeah, and there is company service. And yeah, and here we have application context, but I think that I missed something. But let me just check. Okay, here we have everything. So let me just go to the next step and review it with some validations. Okay, so it's almost exactly the same code, but I just added the validation. So one more time. At the beginning, we are trying to find all components. Here we have method to get beans. We try to find the implementation. If we have it, we should create a bean. And to create a bean, we need a constructor, and we have it. We need to find the parameters, and then we are able to create a new instance. Okay, but we created the proxy for some reason. So now, let me just wrap it. So let's back to the step 2. And here I have something like create a new proxy. Yeah, previously we didn't have a proxy because I didn't wrap it. So let's be back to the next step, application context. Yeah, and where we can create a proxy. New instance. Yeah, there is new object. So let me, I forget. Okay, let me extract it to bean. And previously we created bean like this. Here we should return it. And our type is T. Class loader from the application context. I think that it's okay. What is the interface? We don't have it, but we can just add it to arguments. T and interface item, because I cannot put interface. So here is the interface. And I'm going to handle my object using proxy handler. Yeah? So let me put bean here. And yeah, I forgot about adding the interface because we need to define it. So it's just a class from the getBean method. Here is everything okay? Yes, so let me run the code. Yeah, and you can see that we have begin transaction, do something in service, begin transaction, do something in DAO. And I don't want to do something like this because I have a proxy handler that handles everything in the transaction. And for example, I don't want to create a new transaction when I'm in the DAO. So what we can do, exactly the same thing like we have in Spring. We can create a transactional annotation. But we should put it on the method. And finally, I can go to my application and hey, it should be transactional. And here, update component should also be transactional. And in my proxy handler, I can refactor a little this code. Method invoke, let me create it something like calculate the result. Okay. And everything is handled in transactions, so maybe I can also extract this part. Handle in transaction, but at the beginning, I should check that method is transactional. So if is transactional, the method, then we should return, we should handle it in transaction. If not, we should just calculate the result. Okay, and how we can implement the method is transactional. I would say it's a tricky one because at the beginning I thought that we should do something like method is annotation present transactional. And it doesn't work. An idea why? Because we are talking about the dynamic proxy, so we are talking about the interfaces. And our interface doesn't have the transactional method. So that's why we need to check that we have the annotation on our object to handle, so on our implementation. So it's transactional, so get class, get method, with exactly the same name, with exactly the same arguments, get parameters, and we have it. So we can call it like object method. Okay. And then we can use on the object method, we need to catch the exception. So let me refactor it a little and return it here. And in case of any problems, it should not be transactional. Maybe not the best idea, but let's keep it simple. And let's back to step 4. And we should have only one transaction. Of course, we don't have propagation, so please imagine that it's something like required new. So we always creating a new transaction. But there is another tricky part. In my company service imp, please imagine that I'm calling the create company, but I'm not calling the method from the DAO, but from the update company, from the same bin. Something like this. So this method is transactional, so I should open the transaction. And this method is transactional, so I should open another transaction. And no, we have only one transaction. Why? Because we are calling in from the scope of the same bin. So please imagine that I'm removing the transactional here, and we will not have the transaction. So let me, you can see that we do not have any transaction. Company, okay, everything is okay, so let me back. Here is transactional, and here is transactional, so let me put a lot of breakpoints. So maybe it's not clear, but let me explain you. Here in our proxy handler is transactional, handle in transaction, and debug the code. And I would say it's the most important part, because we will not be able to see that something is wrong on our production code, because we will not have any warnings from IntelliJ or whatever, or maybe you have. Maybe we have, but let's imagine that we don't have it. And here we are calling the company service proxy. And there is a, I don't know that you can see it, but there is a proxy. So we are calling not the company service imp, but we are calling the create company on the proxy class. So let's move to another place. And here in the proxy, we are checking that the method is transactional. Yes, it is, so handle in transaction. Then we are going to the create company method. We are calling update company. We are calling the company from the scope of the same bin. So here we have this, it's the same. And you can see that there is a company service imp. And it will not work because we have nothing that should handle our transaction. So that's why it doesn't work. Of course, we can do something like this, but I would not recommend. We can create a private, and we can, in a company service, we can just inject the company service. And just inject it. In Spring, it works. But it doesn't look very well, Because now the company service, it's also the company service inputs wrapped with the proxy. Okay, so the transactional is just example. So I'm going to show you the next step. And here I already implemented another annotation for cache. So in my company service imp, I have one method, generate token. And please imagine that there is some complex operation to generate token, and business decide that, okay, it's enough that for the same company, it's okay to return exactly the same token. So we can implement something like cacheable. And in my proxy handler, I need to store somewhere this cache. So I can use the map for it. In my map, in the key, is just list of object. What is the list of object? It's just a method with arguments. So if you are calling the method, the same method, with exactly the same arguments, we should just returning the result from the map. So we have result, let's take it from the map. If it's not null, we should just return it. If we do not have it, and it's the first time that we are calling the method with exactly the same arguments, we should just continue, and in calculate result, I'm also checking that it's cacheable. It's exactly the same way how we implement transactional, but I just overwrite the transaction. And here, after the calculation, I'm adding the result to my map. So please note that I'm not talking about only the transaction. It could be cacheable or pre-authorized or whatever that's using proxy. Okay, so let's go to almost the last step. And do you know what is the main difference between our application and Spring? Maybe I can show you in the main. So please imagine that I'm going to create a, I don't need it. Here I'm getting from the context company service, and we have 1 and 2. And if we would compare it, what should we have in the Spring? True or false? True. Sorry? Yeah, exactly the same, because singleton is the default scope of the Spring, so it's the main difference between our application. We have a different object, but it's not a big problem, because we can, in my framework, create a new enum scope. And let's keep it simple, only 2, singleton, and prototype. So now we are using prototype, so we are always creating a new bin. So here, I can just create a scope with default value singleton. Okay, but how we can implement it? In our application context, we have something like in get bin, we are creating a new bin, but I don't want to create a new one. But first, let me take the annotation, get annotation component. Okay. Class 0, okay. And let's call it component. And if our component has scope like singleton, then we shouldn't create a new implementation. We shouldn't create a new object if we have it. But first we need to store it somewhere. So something similar like here, private final, map with the class as a key, and as a value object with the implementation, it's our bin. So let's call it singleton bins. And it could be new hash map. We will see if it could be. Import singleton bins, and I can do exactly the same like previously when I talk about the cache, but there is a great method like from the map, calculate if absent. So hey, if we have something in the map for the class, like company, if we have a company service, please just take the result. If not, we should just create it, and we already have the method to do this. Okay. Everything is okay, so let me run the application. And something is wrong here, because we have concurrent modification exception, because there is a create bin. Here we have a new instance, find constructor parameters, get bin, and we are in the same place, yeah? So we have recursion. So instead of hash map, we can use concurrent hash map, but it's not always true. It also depends, but using this version of Java, it works. Yeah, and now I have true. So let me go to main class, debug it. I need to at the breakpoints. Okay, I lost it. One more time. And use why? I muted it. Okay, the last chance. You can see that I have exactly the same objects. So our scope working, but we can always change it, yeah? In my component, I can change the scope to prototype. And now I would expect that we will have something like false, because we will have a different object. Okay, and the last step is just about mostly refactoring. Because as you can see in proxy handler, we have a lot of logic, and I just extracted it to cacheable handler. So to generate a key using a method and arguments, and take result or calculate, and I'm using the supplier to calculate the result, and exactly the same for transactional. I just move everything here, and I have a begin transaction, commit transaction, and rollback transaction. Everything what is related to the transaction is here. And in my proxy invocation handler, I'm just creating a new object for the handlers, like a shareable, transactional, and so on. And what we just did, it's the main class. And we created, during this session, we created a dependency injection framework with auto-wired, with components, we have some scope. We implemented the transactional. I know that it's simplified and we did, but the logic is almost exactly the same, yeah? At the beginning, we should do something with entity manager. And we have a cache, so we can generate a token, and for the same object, we should have exactly the same result. And mostly that's all. And please do not remove Spring from your project. Yeah, there is we just simplified a lot. We don't have a propagation. We don't have propagation for transactional. We don't have a qualifier annotation and a lot of features. We just had 45 minutes to implement something like this. So if something is not clear, I would recommend you go to the repository. I described everything step by step. I'm not sure that we have time for the questions. If not, I will be there. So thank you so much.